Hello, thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Betty and I write short stories inspired by vintage treasures I find in the wild, usually in the flea markets, the thrift stores or antique shops. I also have a Feel Good Friday comedy vlog where I share with you all the things that I've found and chat about all the things that I love, which are cats, plants, snacks and knickknacks. I hope you enjoy today's story. It is set in the 1990s, is a modern-day fairy tale inspired by traditional themes, and is entirely fictional. I made it all up. It is not based on anyone I've ever met, nor anything I've ever done. Thank you very much. It is called Mrs. Catmas Comes to Town. This Christmas was going to be the first Christmas in her whole life that Agnes had spent all alone, on her own, in her own home, and she could not be more thrilled about it. She absolutely loved Christmas, the anticipation, the excitement, the decorations, the mince pies, and the fairy lights. You could have fairy lights every night of the year if you wanted, but the build-up to the shared global experience made it far more meaningful to her. They were Christmas lights. Oh, this year was her first ever year of being completely clear of obligations to other people's needs, and she had never felt more excited. Finally free to revel and roll in her unashamed love of festive fun, at last rid of the crushing doom of her family's desires to ruin everything, sabotage her happiness and crush her Christmas dreams. She felt like a child experiencing the joy of it all for the very first time. Agnes Merriweather owned a small but extremely successful fleet of mobile coffee trucks. Well, people called them trucks, but technically they were Bedford Rascal vans, and you could probably fit about 4 in the back of a Ford Transit if you were good at Tetris. She had grown up in a village in the furthest extremities of Cornwall, had gone to university in Manchester, and spent several years working in finance in the city in London, largely having been coerced into this career by her mother, but on the brink of a breakdown brought on by being in an utterly hateful job, surrounded by horrible colleagues. She'd had a brilliant idea. It was impossible to know for sure at the time that it was a brilliant idea, because no one had tried nor tested it. Cafe culture had not fully integrated itself into English society in the early 1990s. A coffee to go came out of a tin, from a greasy spoon in a small polystyrene cup with a greasy film on top, and you wouldn't walk around with it in your hand. You'd put it in the cup holder compartment of your Ford Fiesta and spill it at the traffic lights. But she had reached the point of absolutely no return. She'd been called to the manager's office one too many times. The grey-faced woman called Anne, in a polyester navy next trouser suit, with a Breton striped top underneath, who gave her final warning for standing in the wrong area of the office between 10:30 and 11:45, didn't realise Agnes would take it literally, as final, and though it was to be her first dramatic act of self-preservation, there would be a steady stream of them thereafter. She'd gotten a taste for it. It was incomprehensible to her friends, who were all starting to settle down, buy bigger houses, and accept that the partner that they were with was probably going to have to be good enough now, and that just at the point of reaping the rewards of sticking at a job, she would jack it all in. Some of them even talked about moving back to their hometowns. London's no place for old women, is it? She tried to keep most of the details of her life from her mother, as even a minutiae of information could be manipulated into devastating consequences at any unexpected point in the future. However, she had to tell her that she had left a job just in case Mother called the company. Unsurprisingly, Mrs. Merriweather delighted in her daughter's apparent London failure and expected her to return home, no doubt to look after her. What came as a big surprise to Mrs. Merriweather was her daughter's announcement that she was not coming home, but she was buying an old van and was going to sell coffee out of the back of it. A concept so horrifying to her ego that not only was her product going into catering, she was working in a burger van. She didn't call her daughter again for 6 months, and that was the most liberating 6 months of Agnes's life. And from HR's final warning actually came at the perfect time. It was spring and a whole summer of festivals and weekenders lay ahead. Agnes bought a rascal camper van out of loot, ripped out the bunk beds and installed a bench, walled it on a fold-down window shelf and set off on the road to anywhere. Within 4 years she had 4 vans and bought a pink-fronted 4-storey townhouse on Portobello Road with cash. She liked to joke that each van paid for each floor of her mansion and affectionately called it Rascal Manor. It had not been an easy ride by any stretch. Convincing people to buy firstly a gourmet coffee, secondly a gourmet coffee from a van in 1995 had been a constant battle. It was going to be another 3 years before Starbucks arrived on the King's Road and turned carrying a coffee into a necessary lifestyle accessory, and Agnes always felt that she had built the bed for them to lie in. Nevertheless, she had it. She just knew it. She had just cracked on. She started by buying a big stainless steel urn from a caravan company, catering size packs of tea bags, instant coffee and hot chocolate from the Continental grocery store on Bethnal Green Road, and 2-litre bottles of water from the supermarket. She knew that this was not ideal, plus she was using the universally despised long-life UHT milk since that great summer sourage incident in a field in Dorset. So, in one of her many drastic actions, she drove that little rascal to Italy, with a name and address on the back of an envelope given to her by a bloke on Brick Lane, to meet a man who had an old Italian espresso coffee-making machine, formerly from a 1960s gelateria. Still at an age not to require sleep, she didn't even spend the night in Milan, despite its many attractions. Aggie took a lesson in Italian hand gestures on how to operate the coffee machine from the gelatinous jolly previous owner, drank what she'd brewed and steamed straight back to London, fueled by caffeine. Never had she felt more alive, or more convinced that she'd struck gold. She stopped off in Tilbury Docks on the way back. She bought a 12-volt Boat fridge, a bank of 4 truck batteries, off a docker with no questions asked, and then she knew she was sorted. She'd cracked it. Inspired by that fleeting visit to the cafe in Milan, Agnes got her rascal resprayed in a turquoise green with a red and gold Art Deco sign writing AM Cafe, and decorated the interior in the style of a glamorous 1920s cinema foyer. She brewed, pressed and frothed the best coffee in town, created her own hot chocolate spice blend and persuaded an old client in the council from her finance days to grant her a street vendor's license on the best spots in town, where she proceeded to rake it in. She worked day and night, and whilst managing 3 employees operating other rascals was very profitable, she knew that it was her that people had bought into. Customers loved her. Whether it was a passing tourist or a daily regular local, her charm and chat would be the highlight of their day. Often as a consequence of being distracted by their conversation, customers would take their coffee but leave their gloves, hats, folders, books, sometimes whole shopping bags, and occasionally what Agnes called a UFO, an unidentified foreign object, which she had learnt the hard way never to open, as the owner would always return to claim it with a sheepish nod. This would happen so often, Agnes had a designated lost property box inside the van called YFY, You Forgot Yo, which never failed to fill up fast in the run-up to Christmas, as office workers and shoppers had a few festive drinks, so much so that she got a bigger box for December. One of her most favourite customers was Nancy, an elegant elder barrister who always wore a long black coat, lived in Dolphin Square, which was notorious for the Profumo affair and many other international indiscretions, and could spin the most compelling yarns about rogues and scoundrels that she had either defended or prosecuted, claiming they were largely indistinguishable from each other. Their conversation would momentarily stop while Agnes prepared a customer's order, and as soon as they were out of earshot, Nancy would supply a succinct "gangster, 15 years for armed robbery," or "bent copper, been dealing cocaine since 1982. Sometimes just "Foreign Office" would be enough, or very rarely "don't know him, mustn't have been caught yet." Although several decades older and wiser than Agnes, Nancy admired her bravery and loved her spirit. Equally, Agnes delighted in Nancy's comedic take on her life with the worst of London's underworld and overlords. Although they never met socially, only chatting in the street by the Rascal, Agnes felt safe to share her true feelings with Nancy in a way that she couldn't with her friends or family. Nancy would just get it. Then she'd sweep off into the night, taking Aggie's confessions with her into the London fog, or the Barraboy and Banker on London Bridge. One thing she had shared with Nancy not long after meeting her was just how much she hated going home for Christmas. How despite turning 30 next year, running this brutal business out in all weathers, fighting off all sorts, and buying her own house, she could not escape the coercive control of her parents. Last year she had worked till midnight on Christmas Eve, frozen to the bone, and just longed to have Christmas Day to herself, curled up on the sofa in new toasty pyjamas, eating the bounty from the unclaimed YFY haul, and sending gratitudes to all the strangers who had unintentionally gifted her a kilo of dolce, pickled quail's eggs, 2 pairs of cashmere socks, and a luxurious assortment of delicatessen treats that only ever get bought at Christmas. She genuinely hoped that people would come back, so she could reunite them with their Fortnum & Mason truffle-encrusted Manchego cheese and brandy snaps hand-rolled in Havana. But she also enjoyed the fun in the free food. It felt like people were giving her the presents she should have received from her parents. But no. She had shut the hatch door on the van on Christmas Eve at midnight, got into bed at 2 a.m, and then set off on the 6-hour drive on Christmas morning at 8 o'clock, purely out of a sense of obligation to her parents, who held no reciprocal sense of duty. They had honed their codependent sense of coercive control over her for 30 years, and there was no sign of a loosening of the noose. It had been a grueling journey with slate, black ice, desolated motorways and isolated back roads to arrive at a Christmas tree-free house with no dinner. No dinner. She didn't even tell her friends that her parents felt the most fun that they could have would be to sit in their warm, safe house all day, waiting for her to arrive, so they could not have Christmas dinner together on Christmas Day. There wasn't even a mince pie in the cupboard. Nothing. Agnes had had a lifetime of this nonsense. The moods, the hysterics, the silences of simmering spite, the emotional traps, and all she said was, "There's no dinner." In a way it was a relief. They knew how much she loved the things that came with Christmas, the anticipation, the tree, the decorations, the dinner. She actually couldn't care less about fancy presents or well-thought-out gifts, which was just as well because she didn't get any. As the words, "There's no dinner," came out of her mouth, she knew they'd forced her hand, and this should really be the last straw. Not the last cheese straw, there wasn't any, but the final acceptance that her own parents were the most hostile and dangerous relationship she had. It was a harrowing living bereavement, but at the same time a breakthrough in one dry cheese Christmas Day sandwich. Her mother knew it. Her last words from the kitchen when Agnes was preparing to return to London were, "You're not coming back next year, are you?" She'd normally pacify her parents' emotional abuse and take the path of least resistance, but her unconditional love was now dead. She left without leaving an answer. All the way back to London she repeated, "Never again, never, never again," and spent most of the year convinced she was rid of them. On the same day she picked up the keys to her new house, December the 1st, she received the message she was dreading. "Are you coming home for Christmas? It's just that your dad's not well." It was a standard ruse, used and abused for years to emotionally blackmail her into submission, and what she could only assume was muscle memory, in the moment she caved. Yes. The whole month of December was the best month of her life. She couldn't believe she owned this house, and every night she came back from standing at the van, she wandered around each room, planning and dreaming of colour schemes, furniture, style and design, But most importantly of all, imagining where her future cat would sleep and scratch and play. Even as she decorated her first tree all alone in the house, she anticipated the delight of seeing her cat attack it. It would be a dream come true. The nightmare of Christmas Day loomed large, however, so she cherished every moment of the atmosphere in London, all the parties, the well-wishers, the warmth the season brought out in strangers. As yet there was no sign of Nancy, but she never normally appeared until after dark anyway. Agnes had bought her a present weeks ago and she couldn't wait to give it to her. By 9 o'clock the Y of Y box was full to the brim. All her regulars had been and gone, shared their Christmas wishes and had their last spiced hot chocolate of the year. But there was still no sign of Nancy, and the streets were almost empty. Agnes waited till 10, hoping that people would return at the last minute for their lost property and that Nancy would arrive. But the streets were deserted and she didn't really feel very safe standing there with all that cash on her. With a mixed sense of relief that the workday was over and the sadness that she faced another miserable Christmas with her family, Agnes pulled down the awning on the side of the van, locked it in place, picked up her A-board with the drinks menu and stored it securely inside the van, closing the back doors behind her as she turned off and locked down the machines for the drive home. It was a routine she'd done 1,000 times, but as she wiped the pipe on the milk steamer, she heard a strange noise. Oh no, she thought, it's not on the blink. Not now, not Christmas Eve. She wiped it again. Silence. No. Then the noise again. She spun around, as quickly as she could in a rascal with a 4-foot height clearance, and scanned the van. It had gone silent again. Was she going mad? Had she had too much of her own coffee? Had the cold finally got into her brain? A bag moved. Bloody hell, a black bag like a holdall was in the Y of Y box, and she had definitely not put it in there. It moved again. Bloody hell, she thought, as panic started to rise inside her. What if it's a head? What if it's Nancy? What if it's Nancy's head? What are you thinking, woman? If it's a head, it's dead. She calmed herself as best she could with the thought that if it was something for the police, it would at least mean that she had an acceptable excuse not to drive home. Okay, please let it be a dead head, but not Nancy's. Agnes crouched over the bag and felt around for the zipper. The bag had stopped moving. Slowly, she slid open the zip round the top of the holdall and lifted the flap. Nothing in her mind had prepared her for what she saw inside. 4 wide eyes, and 2 tiny terrified faces stared up into her terrified face staring down. Kittens. It was kittens. 2 tiny little black kittens with tins of Fortnum & Mason kitten food were in her lost property box. That night, Christmas Eve in Notting Hill, 1999, sitting in her living room with nothing but a sofa and a cardboard box for a coffee table, Agnes watched as 2 tiny baby kittens pounced and played with scattered baubles from her Christmas tree, and as she picked up the phone, she dialed the familiar number. Oh, hi, Mum. Hey, listen, sorry, don't bother saving any Christmas dinner for me this year. Yeah.